Connecticut Valley Views covered many vital subjects during 2011 with relevant and knowledgeable guests, which have included Erica Tyndall from the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Michelle Cruz, Connecticut Victim Advocate. Please join me for the highlight segments and view the entire shows on our website www.ctvalleyviews.com. Hello, I'm Susan Regan. Today our guest is Erica Tyndall, Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Welcome.
Thank you.
A pleasure to have you here,
Thank
Erica.
you for having me.
And apologies for your last
Oh,
name.
not a problem, not a problem.
Are you seeing more domestic violence, or are people becoming more aware of it?
I am reticent to say that domestic violence, the levels are rising. We know that it's still grossly underreported. Our programs are the ones that provide comprehensive services and a range of services, from hotline to crisis intervention, safety planning. We have a family violence victim advocate program where there are advocates in the courts. It would be wonderful to expand that to the civil courts where people are getting divorced and fighting over custody. So I wouldn't say that domestic violence is on the rise. I think there's much more awareness, and so people are becoming aware that,
Which is good. It's coming coming to the forefront. And now you said an interesting thing, though. You said men, women, and children.
Yes.
If you were to put a percentage on it, we tend to believe and think women and children.
Yes.
What about men? Is there a percentage of men who literally call up and say, I need help?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
We're not just talking male children, we're talking
Oh, no, we're
grown
talking,
men too.
Yes, grown men. We have safe house referrals for grown men who are victims. That number is much smaller. This problem really is largely men's violence against women. And when I say violence, I don't just mean physical violence. As an attorney, I can tell you that I have had clients that I've represented and their boyfriends never touched them. Never put their hands on them. So it's not always, I think we think of as a public physical violence. It can be mental, emotional, financial. Women never being able to control anything in their lives, from what they wear to what they cook to who they socialize with,
right,
to if they contact their families, to where they worship. It runs the gamut.
But there is a point, though, there, because even if you're not suffering physically initially, and it's either verbal, mental, or, as you said, a constriction of some kind in some phase of their life, that leads to physical illness because of the issue.
Yeah.
Whether it's a migraine headache
or
stress-related
issues, absolutely.
And then they want to go to a certain doctor, and then he doesn't want you to go. So it has a ripple effect that goes further than that.
It does. I think that as a public, we tend to think that we are talking about heterosexual couples who are married with children, and there's physical violence, and then the victim accesses services. I think all of us tend to think that way, but we as domestic violence advocates know that that, of course, is not the case. So what we are really talking about is a pattern of coercion, abuse, manipulation, control over another person's ability to have self-determination. We start from the idea that every human being deserves to live free of violence, period. Now, I don't think that any of your viewers or members of the public will say, no, I don't agree with that. We all sort of agree that, yes, okay, everyone deserves to live free of violence. And that means if you are a crack addict, or you're an alcoholic, or you're a terrible parent, or you don't have a lot of money, or you have lots and lots of money, or every human being deserves to live free of violence. And what we focus on is where in intimate relationships, family relationships, partners, spouses, whether they are heterosexual, homosexual, they deserve to live free of violence. And
well, we talk about, we talk about free of violence, but I guess that fine line of knowing when something is just a one-time thing and not beginning to recognize a pattern of something, and then where that fine line gets crossed, and then he perhaps hits her the first time or calls her a bad name for the first time, and then it isn't picked up in the beginning, and they put it under the rug and put it away,
Right.
but then it happens again.
Well, it is a fine line because we're talking about the definition of two things here, really violence, and what does that mean? It's a very
Correct.
strong word, which is, I think, why we think of physical violence. So there's that, where we start to part ways as a public is, what do you mean by violence? And there is a difference between intimate partner violence and an abusive relationship and poor judgment and bad behavior. There's a difference. And also, as human beings, whether we're male or female, but certainly when you're in a relationship with someone, the relationship starts out great.
And you tend to
generally.
excuse things
Of
when you're in love
course, you
with someone.
rationalize that and you justify that.
just
you make
loves me
excuses.
so much.
This jealousy is just about loving me, and so what you have are two people who become codependent on each other. Batterers are just as dependent on their victims, which is why generally the violence escalates when the victim chooses to extract herself.
All right, so give me an example. What are a couple of the things that you do?
Well, we know that the number one risk factor for battering as an adult and for being a victim is that you are a victim yourself as a child of family violence, of domestic violence, or if you witness your parents in an abusive relationship. Now, that's not to say that you definitely will become a batterer, but you are much more likely, and coupled with other things, low self-esteem, poverty, low
Exposure to
academic
other-
achievement, exposure to violence,
Violence.
poor social accountability for violence.
All
you
of
know-
these things actually lead back to Jean Milstein, my former
Mm-hmm.
guest that I've had on, and that where she's dealing with the children. So they are
Yes,
trying
trauma.
to protect it there so we don't get to your situation.
Absolutely. Trauma. If we were to focus just on treating effectively child trauma, years down the line, 3 decades from now, we will be much better off as a society in terms of the prevalence of domestic violence.
Are all the policemen trained to deal with this, or is there a specific department to deal with it? And how do you interface with them? When do they come into the picture for you?
Yeah, all police departments in Connecticut in the 169 towns are trained on domestic violence. Part of what came out of our 1986 Family Violence Prevention and Response Act was some mandatory police training. Now, at that time, I believe it was 2 or 3 hours. It was mandatory. But now there are many departments that have domestic violence units. In Hartford, for example, Chief Darrell Roberts noticed that his numbers were through the roof in terms of domestic violence assaults and arrests that his officers were making, and created a unit. Many other departments have also done that. Now, some are too small to create a separate unit, but many have protocols in place for how to
Specifically
deal with domestic violence cases because they are different crimes. The 1986 Act also defined family violence and what a family or household member was. It can be people who have a child in common but are not married and are not living in the same home. So Connecticut broadly defines family violence, and
could be a
because
grandfather
Yes.
with a grandchild, or
And because it is a
sister
broad-
and brother,
Absolutely.
or whatever.
because it's a broad definition, it's not restricted to married couples with children living in the same household, which is, you can imagine, is a good thing if we are trying
Exactly.
to address it in all arenas.
Of course, and because it takes all forms.
Yes.
It must be recognized as such.
Yes.
Here was rather a dramatic one. I know you know about it. I'm going to read from a March 1st article in the Hartford Courant. It was in Torrington, Connecticut. You advised me. It was by John Kovner. It was reported there was a case of a woman by the name of Tracy Thurman, who in '83 had been abused and battered many times by her husband and then reported him to the police. But they did nothing, and because she did this, he stabbed her 13 times, stomped on her head, broke her neck, and left her at her friend's driveway. She survived and became the first woman in the country to sue a town and its police department for violating her civil rights, saying that she wasn't protected from abuse, and she won an award of $2.3 million. Now, that's a kind of a one-time case. You don't see those kinds of things happen on a
No, those are the
regular basis.
yeah, those are very serious cases that get reported on because, of course, they are newsworthy.
But she had run away from another state.
Miss Thurman had fled Florida with her toddler to escape an abusive relationship, and the husband followed her to Connecticut. So your question before about, how long has it been going on before someone accesses services or asks for help or goes to the court, it's often has been going on quite some time. And you know, this case is quite famous now across the country, but this happened in 1983, and Miss Thurman...
It took a long time to come to this point.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
It's a long...
Yes, and
why
that...
so long? Why not a decision sooner?
Well, oh, you mean a legal decision?
Yes.
Well, the court process takes time.
Right.
The incident occurs, and then there's a period of time
20 years.
Well, she had to heal, first of all. In terms of, you know, filing a lawsuit, you also have to find someone who can understand the legal theory. She won this case. She sued the city of Torrington, the police department, as well as individual police officers for failing under an equal protection argument, for failing to protect her. In other words, the police was treating her as a domestic violence victim differently than they were treating other people. If this had been a stranger, if Buck Thurman had been someone she didn't know,
or something,
the argument goes that the police, you know, and the result of this for Connecticut was the 1986 FIPRA Act, the Family Violence Prevention
Act. It was at the
Act.
86-337
Yes.
Act, Governor O'Neill, I believe.
Yes.
He had a panel of experts studying the issue and put that into place.
This brought Connecticut, I always say kicking and screaming, into a different response to domestic violence victims, to a different criminal justice response. Criminal justice policy is only a piece of the puzzle that needs to fit into place if we're going to effectively address this. But out of that came mandatory arrest, came the definition of family violence, came police protocols, came training for law enforcement, a better coordination. It created the Family Violence Intervention Unit in the judicial branch. It was a comprehensive response, a change in the culture, the criminal justice culture of how we respond to domestic violence victims. Connecticut, you were able as a spouse, as a married spouse, in 1977 to get an order of protection. But it doesn't do much good if, as a wife,
well, you're traveling in the same circles, you're living in the same house.
Right.
I mean, somehow or other you have to break that thing apart. Well, we've talked about the domestic part. We've talked about that. Does this also overlap into the prostitution area or not? I mean, because often perhaps a boyfriend or a husband or whatever.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, it's about control and coercion and abuse. And certainly if a victim is presenting as someone who's being abused in the form of my boyfriend is forcing
monetary
me to,
gain.
Absolutely.
Right.
We absolutely address that. And so it becomes a wider issue of, you know, men's violence against women, intimate partner violence. So certainly we work to address that. But prostitution is about a similar thing of coercion and control.
Now, do you feel that since that act was put into place, do you feel that it's been upheld? Do you think things have fallen through the cracks? Do you think...
Yes and yes.
Okay, okay.
It has been upheld. There are police officers and judges and prosecutors as we speak that are working you know, in accordance with the act and trying to effectively address this issue. And yes, we know of examples where things have fallen through the cracks. And part of the reason why is that everyone has to do their job.
Right, right. All along the way.
Police, judges, prosecutors,
Dot the I's,
domestic
cross the
violence
T's.
advocates, everyone. Everyone has a role
To play.
Absolutely, and it's the message that we try to get out there, that we have to create, and I've been sort of on this stump speech, but we must create a culture of intolerance for this behavior, for this problem. And it's beyond simply don't hit your wife,
right,
or be nice to your girlfriend.
Well, it's a training thing. Well, it goes back to the children again. We were talking about children.
It's about how we're raising our children.
From the beginning. But there has to be, I think, an entire more awareness in society. Thus why we're having you on. Maybe perhaps people will say, you know, I've been noticing how quiet she is whenever they come to the party, or whatever it is. A greater awareness to perhaps for people to say something
Absolutely.
about it.
But it's got to be an awareness and an understanding.
Right.
Many of us are aware of things, but we think,
Right.
oh, it's not our problem. Or, oh, it doesn't affect me.
You're afraid.
Absolutely.
You're
oh,
afraid
absolutely.
of the violent boyfriend.
Absolutely.
If you say something, maybe he'll come and get you, or he'll send somebody after you.
Certainly.
Well, we certainly have enjoyed having you on. You've made us more informed on this subject, and we greatly appreciate it. We do want to give your website, which I will give here, www.ctcadv.org. crimevictimhotline.org, and there is a crisis line, 1-888-774-2900.
And that is a free, confidential,
There you go.
24-hour a
There
day,
you go.
7-day-a-week hotline. You do not have to identify yourself. It doesn't cost
Good,
anything.
great, right. So it's
Absolutely.
confidential. You could perhaps help someone out, a family member. Please do so, and I'm sure your door is always open. And
Absolutely.
people will be there to do a good job. Well, thank you very much,
Thank you so
Erica.
much.
Our guest today is Michelle Cruz. She is Connecticut's state victim advocate. Welcome, Michelle. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Good morning.
Tell me a little bit about your background, how you got this job. I think you started in November 2007, is that correct?
That's
You were appointed
correct.
to the job. What, was this always been kind of a career path for you? Is this what you've been interested in, helping people?
My career path has always been about helping victims of crime, and I began as a lawyer, as an assistant district attorney up in Massachusetts. I worked in 2 different offices. In the last 3 years, I specialized in domestic violence prosecutions, sex assault, and also child abuse cases. And so when I saw the posting, it really kind of fit into all the areas that I'm interested in: legislation, education, victims' constitutional and statutory rights. So it was a nice combination of all the things that I'm really passionate about. So I applied, was interviewed, and here I am.
When these things come into your office, are they generally speaking, is it a direct complaint from a victim? Is it through law enforcement, or does it come from several different directions? But what's mainly the thrust of where these things originate from, requests for assistance from your department?
It's usually, the majority of our complaints are directly from crime victims. So a crime victim could call up and say, I'm a victim, I went to the police, they won't take my report. Or
And why would that be?
well, sometimes sometimes it's an issue of whether or not the crime is really recognized in the way that the victim is presenting it. Sometimes there's just issues with training. It could be a myriad of issues.
Like I was just yelling at my husband and we were having an argument and I called the police and they didn't respond. That kind of thing? Or?
A lot of ours were, when that issue comes up, a lot of times it's either domestic violence, harassment, or stalking. Because sometimes if you don't look at the whole picture, the one event, let's say, my ex-boyfriend's following me.
Right.
It seems innocuous sometimes.
Right, and they don't want to come until something's actually happened.
Yeah, so sometimes it's hard to really, have the police understand that this is a crime, that you have to look at the entire relationship to really understand the stalking, the harassment, or whatever the issue is. So we'll help the victim and, kind of present that to the police, work with the police to understand, what the victim's trying to complain about. A victim could call about, let's say they were in court, their case was resolved and they didn't get to make an impact statement or reach out.
What's an impact statement?
During plea and sentencing of an offender in court, the victim's constitutionally permitted to give an impact statement. And usually that has to do with how the crime impacted them, the victim, and what they want to see happen, whether it's, usually when you ask, what do you want to see happen, a victim's automatically going to say, I'd like them to go to jail.
Yes.
But there's a whole lot of other options, such as counseling, substance abuse treatment, or education, anger management, batterers program. There's a whole list of options that the victim could say in court that they'd like to see happen. It is one of the 2 opportunities that the victim can actually participate in what's happening with the criminal case. Sometimes those cases are resolved without the victim having that input in front of the court. And when that happens, we'll meet with the prosecutor, talk to the victim, kind of find out what happened, and see if there's a way to have those victims
Kind of meet halfway with what they would like and what would be appropriate for the person who committed the, let's call it, crime.
Well, usually if the case is done, the victim can't undo that sentence, which is the law here. But sometimes we can communicate the victim's frustrations with the prosecutor, see how to prevent it from happening in the future, and make sure the victim's voice is heard with the prosecutor, and that they understand why the victim was upset. And if there are any other issues that are out there, say the victim had out-of-pocket expenses, restitution, and that wasn't ordered, we can follow up with the prosecutor, see if we can bring
You
the
have to
case
go to the
back in.
doctor for something or whatever.
And we can see if we can bring the case back in to get a restitution order or some other order that's needed and get the victim's needs met that way.
Do you see the courts moving these things through at a fairly good pace, or does it seem like the issue happened in November and it's not till next spring that you get to go to court? Do you think our courts are working well?
I think
Timely manner?
I think there's a lot of pressure on the courts to resolve cases, and I think there's also, I know that there's issues with, budget reductions, making sure that the courts are staffed in a way that makes sense and that also fits within the budget. Most criminal cases, you're not going to see a conclusion on a small matter up to a year, year and a half. In a sex assault, it could take 3 years.
Wow.
Dr. Pettit's case is on the 4th year.
Very ongoing, yes.
And so these cases, some of the cases just take a long time. And it's frustrating for the victim to have to kind of wade through that. I find that it's best at the beginning of the criminal matter to explain to the victim, this case is probably going to take 2
Some amount of
years.
time.
So the victim knows on the outset, wow, and can kind of know what's going to be coming down the pike.
Do you find ever that the victim goes back to a situation? Let's say something's resolved, and then a year later, and you hear from that same person again, and it turns out they decided to go back with their boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever it was who was the original perpetrator of the issue. Do you find that people get drawn back in?
I definitely, more as a prosecutor, I would see that. At arraignment, the victim may be on board. And then later in the prosecution, the victim wouldn't want to go forward. I think that's part of the process. I think
Where they drop the charges, you mean? Where they say, I've decided
they don't want to go forward anymore. And that happens, I think, for a number of reasons. With domestic violence, often the victim, basically the victim is moving their trust from this relationship and trying to personally manage it to a criminal justice system, which is completely out of their control. At least that's how they feel.
Correct.
And being able to trust that system to keep them safe is sometimes terrifying. And there's also maybe some pressure from the offender, maybe the family, might be financial pressure.
I was going to say fear has a lot to do with it because, the kind of thing where if it's a boyfriend or husband and says to the woman, if you ever tell anybody, and then, of course, then she does tell somebody. So now he's really mad. Now there's a fear factor there, even though you now have law on your side or at least overlooking the situation, there's still that fear.
And you have to be able to...
Because he has friends.
Exactly, and you have to be able to trust the system is going to do what it's supposed to keep you safe. And I think that's a very scary... It's walking into the unknown for the victim.
Does the system keep you safe?
I think it can,
Okay.
to a certain degree. Any victim that's out there who's thinking about leaving or, in the process in the criminal court, the number one question is, do you have a safety plan? What is your safety plan? And do you have a safety plan if things change, a plan B, a plan C? Because that's really the key to keeping victims safe. The criminal justice system is one piece. The safety plan is the entire piece, from the victim's personal safety, the law enforcement piece, the court piece, the advocate, the whole piece. So it's really, that would be the one thing. If they don't know what a safety plan is,
Then you have to educate them
exactly
on that. All right, I'm going to ask you one other thing, because I think when we watch the media, when we watch programs on TV, we watch melodramas of all kinds and CSI and so forth. Obviously, they skew it to have people watch and make it as dramatic as it is. But let's say in the case of a rape victim, let's just take it through. Woman calls on the phone, hysterical, I've been raped, whatever, police are called in, perhaps your department is called, whatever. They come in, the woman obviously there's been some sort of whatever, maybe her clothes are torn, and it's a very violent scene that you come upon, the man's not there. Now let's take us through what happens to that woman, because they make it look as though she's a victim a second time around. She has to go and she has to have pictures taken and so forth and so on. What happens to that rape victim from that point on? What actually happens?
It really depends. It depends. In Connecticut, what happens is if the victim reports and goes to the hospital, It's the victim's choice whether or not to call the police.
Okay.
The victim can go to the hospital. We have SANE nurses now, safe
Isn't
nurses.
911 going to get the police, though? Isn't that?
But it depends. Sometimes the victim will go directly to the hospital.
Oh, I see. Drive.
Sometimes
Okay.
the victim
Or
will
be
call the
driven
police.
or whatever. Okay.
And so if they go to the hospital, they have a window of opportunity to get the sex assault kit if they choose. They'll have a specialized nurse in, I think, a majority of our hospitals
Okay.
now. Not all of them have it. They'll have a specialized nurse that will be familiar with the rape collection evidence. And then it's the victim's choice if they want to pursue the police.
I see. Okay.
The kit is kept for a certain period of time. I want to say 60 days, but don't quote me on that,
Okay.
but I am here saying that.
Right.
But there's a certain opportunity where the police can get involved, but it's the victim's choice. If the victim goes to the police are involved. And then again, if the victim wants to get the rape kit, they can go through with that.
So there's actually a choice here. There's no demonstrative activity by the police that you must do this.
You mean the police may take the victim to get the rape kit, but the victim can always say, I don't want to do this, I don't want to go forward.
I can opt out.
But
I
the
just want
police
to
will still
report I've
look
been
into
raped,
it,
but I
yeah.
don't want to give you any evidence? Is that?
Your victim could do that. What would happen is the police still have to investigate. When a crime is brought to their front door, they have to do an investigation. Then what happens is the police will do their investigation. If they believe they have probable cause, they'll fill out a warrant application. They'll provide it to the prosecutor. The prosecutor will review it. If they believe that they have enough evidence, they'll sign it. That's then sent over to a judge. If the judge sees there's enough probable cause, they sign it, and then we're off to the arrest.
Okay.
Or if it's clear at the scene and there's, if they come upon a sex assault,
Right.
the police can arrest right then. But traditionally, there's the warrant process. Once the arrest is made, the biggest misnomer in our system is that a victim will report when the case is in court, they'll get a phone call from the court. That doesn't happen unless it's a homicide. What happens is the victim actually has to take a step, write a letter to the court saying, I want to be involved in the process. Here's my information, how to get a hold of me, and the letter has to go to the prosecutor. Unless that happens, you're not really reserving your rights to participate in the system.
Yeah, I'm going to say you're not there to give your statements or anything else. So there is cooperation required by the victim in order to have their say in court. Otherwise, the whole thing sort of continues on more or less without you.
But I think there's also, in Massachusetts, for example, when there's a crime and there's an arraignment, the victim will get a phone call at arraignment, regardless of whether or not they've told anybody they want to be involved. If they say at that point, listen, I don't want to talk to you, leave me alone, they won't probably call again. But here, you actually have to tell the court, tell the prosecutor, I want to be involved, I want to give an impact statement, however you want to be involved. So that you have to actually opt into the system.
Well, it's been a very interesting time talking to you. I hope we've shed some light, certainly, on people who are victims or people who are aware of people who are victims. We encourage people that they can call the department, and we'd like to give your website so that they can take a look at it, get some information, and certainly call your office if necessary. That website is www.ct.gov/OVA. I think I've got it right?
Yeah, that's great. Yep.
Well, I appreciate it, Michelle. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure that we appreciate very much all that you've done for the community and what you will be doing going forward.
Thank you for having me.
We hope that you have enjoyed the highlights from our Connecticut Valley Views show series and invite you to view the programs in their entirety on our website, www.ctvalleyviews.com. Our thanks to Windsor Federal Savings for making this program possible. Neighbors helping neighbors since 1936.